Welcome back to MediaScience MYTH BUSTING. I'm your host, Philip Lomax, and I'm joined by Dr. Dwayne Varan. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing the myth that disabling fast forwarding harms programming. So Dr. Varan, please give us the history of this myth.
Well, once upon a time, as we came into the new millennium, there was this thing called DVRs, like TiVo, digital video recorders. And this was a game changer, and it really threatened the TV networks in particular. They were terrified that people wouldn't watch ads anymore. And so one response to that was to really embrace video on demand on cable. And so publishers began embracing video on demand. And one of the immediate questions they had to grapple with was, should they disable fast forwarding during ad breaks? There was no question that the advertisers wanted that, right? And this was a large part of the rationale with going to VOD, was to kind of come up with an environment where people were still getting exposure to the ads. However, there were also fears. What would the consequences be to the program experience? Would the program be a worse experience if they did this? Was there going to be damage to the network? Was there going to be damage to the cable provider? Would this lead to people canceling their subscriptions? Certainly, if you ask people, do you want us to disable fast forwarding during ads? People are going to say no. The question was to really understand what the effect was at a behavioral level. If that was the proposition, would people accept the proposition, or would they kind of resist it, or would it kind of have some harm associated with it? So that was the background in terms of A&E approaching us, A&E networks approaching us and asking us to help them resolve that question.
So how did you go about tackling this question?
Well, it was a very complex question because what we had to do in the lab is we had to actually create our own VOD platform. We had to have the ability to do exactly what this study required in a way that looked and felt exactly like the A&E experience.
So ecological validity.
100%. And in fact, I remember it was a very, very, very painful process because we kept building these prototypes, and the A&E executives would look at it and say, nope, that's not quite right. That's not exactly what our fast forwarding. It was very, very, very subtle differences around how the fast forwarding was advancing through frames. And we had to keep doing it until we had something that was exactly like A&E's VOD platform. And then once we did that, what we did is we had two cells, a control cell where they could fast forward and a treatment cell where they couldn't fast forward, where we disabled fast forwarding. And then what we did is we basically tested to see, okay, well, was the ad more effective? Of course the ad was more effective, no surprise there. But what else would we see in terms of the damage to both the distributor and the network and the program?
So what did you find in this initial study?
So the first big surprise that we found was that there was a positive benefit associated with disabling fast forwarding. And that was that when people fast forwarded, particularly in this new digital environment where fast forwarding was fast, it wasn't like the VCR era where it was relatively slow and clumsy. Now in this new one, everybody would overshoot the ad break. And then they had to kind of go back, and it was a little bit of an effort there to get back to the start of the program. So that was the first. It's obvious in hindsight, but at the time that was a little bit of a discovery because VOD was relatively new. But in terms of the main questions, so there were a number of things that we found that were really important. The most important question, of course, from A&E's perspective, is what would this do for the program? And this is an example of a slide of the data that we saw for Duck Dynasty, which was one of A&E's most popular shows at the time. And what you're looking at here is the galvanic skin response of the people who either had their fast forwarding disabled or not. And what you see is there's actually no difference in their viewing experience. There's a big difference during the ad breaks, of course, but outside of the ad breaks, you see no difference in how they experience the program. And similarly, this is another example. Here we were looking at using facial coding data, facial expression analysis, and we're looking at analyzing the moments of humor in the ad. And again, the content was equally funny whichever cell you were at. And so this allowed us to conclusively reach the insight that in actual fact, there was no adverse effect to the program. And similarly, we had a lot of measures associated with the perception of the cable provider and likewise, there was no adverse consequence to the cable provider. So what we concluded in the study was that even though people don't like the idea of disabling fast forward, if that's actually the proposition on hand, they accept it, and it doesn't have an adverse effect. That, by the way, won the Case Study of the Year award at the Media Engagement Conference in the year that we had done that research. So that was a really fun project that we did.
So Dr. Varan, are these findings still relevant today? And how do they relate to the multitude of video on demand choices that we have, as well as things like ad skipping?
Well, you raise a really good point, and the short answer is I don't know. Because we would have to retest that question in today's landscape. At the time, VOD really was the only way that, short of a DVR, that you could experience this content. So the network had control over where this content resided, and they chose to put it on VOD. They didn't have it on many platforms at that time. But today, you have that content available in many different platforms. And so if you have a platform where fast forwarding is disabled, and you have another one where it's not disabled, it could be that people migrate to the place where they can fast forward through the ad. So this is one of those questions where we have to really re-examine it in the context of today's landscape.
But it also makes a lot of sense to examine it within a controlled experiment, because as you illustrated to us earlier, what people say is often very different than how they experience these types of viewing journeys.
100%. I think that the method that we used is the right method. You're looking at people's behavior, not their stated responses. But again, it's probably one of those myths that we have to re-examine in the context of the modern times.
Indeed. So on today's episode, we discussed the myth that disabling fast forwarding could harm publishers' programs. So Dr. Varan, what say you?
This is a little bit more complicated, because if we talk about it in the context of the available evidence, we would have to say the myth is busted, but we need to re-examine that question to see whether that bust still holds today. So a qualified bust.
Qualified bust. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us again on today's episode. I'm Philip Lomax. This is Dr. Dwayne Varan, and thank you, our audience.